Bom, gostaria de agradecer também em nome da Anvisa, em nome da Coordenação de Pesquisa Clínica e da Gerência Geral de Medicamentos, por mais esta oportunidade, sem dúvida nenhuma, mais um tema muito relevante, né, de modo particular aqui na pesquisa clínica nós temos implementado algumas medidas de reconhecimento de Reliance. Então, temos uma expectativa bastante grande em relação a essas três oportunidades, né? E em relação aos palestrantes, então, a quem agradecemos muito pela oportunidade de compartilhar com a gente as suas experiências nesse tema. E, por fim, gostaria de agradecer também a Interpharma por ter nos oportunizado essas palestras e a todos os participantes aí que, como vemos, são bastante, né, bastante gente já na sala. Então, muito obrigado a todos.
Esqueci, você muda. Bom, pessoal, bom dia. Para aqueles que não me conhecem, sou a Raquel, trabalho na Interpharma, na área regulatória, junto com a Solange, a Priscila, Tayana, essa é a nossa área. A gente está muito feliz por poder realizar esse workshop, essas palestras vão ajudar muito, como a Solange e o Cláudio Osmancha disseram, tá? E conosco hoje nós temos o Dr. Samuel Azatin, me perdoe se eu não pronunciei corretamente, ele lidera a equipe de regulatório, né, de convergência regulatória, em networks do Departamento de Regulamentação e Pré-Qualificação da Organização Mundial da Saúde. Ele é pediatra com PhD em Farmacologia Clínica e Regulamentação de Produtos Médicos. É um prazer tê-lo conosco. Também temos a doutora Rebeca Lunstein, co-presidente do Grupo de Trabalho Regulatório de Biológico da Afifarma e membro do Grupo de Trabalho de Terapias Avançadas da FPMA. Também é diretora de Global Regulatory Policy and Intelligence na Pfizer, cientista pós-doutorada com PhD do Fitzwilliam College da Universidade de Cambridge, do Reino Unido, em sinalização celular. Também é muito bom tê-la conosco, doutora Rebeca. Para os participantes, a gente está hoje com uma novidade, nós estamos hoje com a possibilidade de tradução simultânea, então aqueles que quiserem ouvir ou em inglês ou só em português, nós temos aqui um iconezinho do lado do Reactions, onde você pode deixar off, colocar o inglês ou em português. Sejam muito bem-vindos e vamos dar início, então, às nossas palestras. Dr. Samuel.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. And thank you very much for the introduction and also for inviting me to deliver a presentation at this important meeting. I'm representing the Department of Regulation and Pre-Qualification at WHO headquarters in Geneva. And Anvisa is one of the key partners for us. So it's important to be able to deliver our messages to Anvisa and to other involved parties in this webinar. So my presentation is about access to essential medicines. And as we know, access to essential medicines is an indispensable part of any human being, part of their right to health. And this is what is mentioned and clearly described in WHO Constitution when it was developed at the establishment of the World Health Organization in 1948. But access to essential medicines is also important because good health is not possible without medical products. Medical products are considered as instrument of public health. And even most modern or relatively recent concept of universal health coverage heavily depends on availability of quality assured and affordable health products in sufficient quantities. However, access to medical products remains a global challenge. As of today, according to WHO estimations, about 2 billion people in the world have no access to essential medicines or very limited access. And this shuts them off from the benefits of modern science and medicine. And there are many reasons of this difficult situation. And among these reasons is lack of collaboration and work sharing in medicine's regulatory area between different countries, and the lack of reliance, lack of use of information from other sources, which actually leads to duplication of efforts. Yes, and so while we are focusing on approval of regulatory approval of medical products, because as I said, to improve public health, we need to increase access to safe and effective medicines of good quality. And focusing on in-country authorization of medical products as one factor in time is important, because it takes because the time it takes for beneficial therapy sometimes is enormous, and so we need to address this challenge. Another problem of modern regulatory work is that we are living in globalized world with all the consequences of globalization. And we know that all medical products should be used and can be used in any country only after they are approved by the national regulatory authority of this country, or in some exceptional cases also by regional regulatory authorities. And this is very much in line with the current international standards. And it has been perfectly described in a number of World Health Assembly resolutions. However, it's quite difficult to imagine how this expectation could be converted into real life in the time when it is practically unrealistic for any regulatory authority, even the most well-established and well-equipped, to manage all regulatory functions under one national roof, under one national setting for most regulators in the world. And this is another consequence of globalization of regulatory science. Also, if you look at the existing medical products, more recent or new medical products, they are quite complex and sophisticated, and they are demanding also the presence of advanced health systems and something that we call quality use. And so living in the situation of globalization in medical products regulation, we have to be able to address or to answer some of the questions, such as, for example, the ability or need to assess and inspect all products coming to the markets. Do we really, for any regulatory authority, do we really need to spend our resources on assessment and inspection of all products coming to the markets? Do we need to do repetitive assessments and inspections if they have already been conducted by someone else, someone who we trust? Is this repetitive process giving any added value? And if we decide that we can rely on someone else's information, something that has been developed by a regulatory authority elsewhere, not in our country, how we should build confidence in these scientific assessments and inspections outcomes, which are carried out by other regulators. Simply said, if we want to rely, how we can make sure that the authority that we are planning to rely upon is reliable. Another question that is also very important: are the new products equally fitting for all types of health systems and health providers available in the countries? Because as I've mentioned, these new products are quite sophisticated and complex. And also, when the new products are coming to a new country, do we always take into consideration the benefit risk assessment of the local situation, depending on the product and the situation in the country? And what are those important competencies, regulatory competencies, which are needed for the regulators, for them to be able to perform their regulatory work properly? We have been trying to ensure that there will be a specific resolution of the World Health Assembly that will address the problem of regulatory system strengthening. And finally, in 2014, the 67th World Health Assembly has issued a resolution of 6720, which was very instrumental and important in highlighting the important role of the regulatory systems within the overall context of health system. So it is now very obvious that no health system could be really strong and effective if it is not involving a strong regulatory system as its indispensable part. And also regulators are now being more and more recognized as an independent profession, and they are considered as essential part of the health workforce. But what is also more important and very important is that this resolution 6720 recognized and highlighted that inefficient regulatory systems themselves can be a barrier to access to safe, effective, and quality medical products. So we have to look at the regulatory landscape in the world and answer the question: are all regulatory authorities or regulatory systems in the world equally equipped and strong enough to perform their regulatory capacity? Unfortunately, the answer is no. As of today, about 30% of regulatory authorities in the world have very limited capacity or almost no capacity to perform core regulatory functions. And there is a serious gap between regulatory systems in low-income and high-income countries in terms of availability of resources, including human and financial resources, availability of also ability to perform key regulatory functions, availability of expertise to fulfill regulatory functions, even availability of proper training for regulators, and also applying the principles of quality management in the regulatory work. And so WHO, being very concerned with this situation, is trying to put all possible efforts to change it. And the complex of measures that we are implementing involves promotion of good governance and transparency in the regulation of medical products. We also promote and facilitate the process of building up very strong national regulatory systems, which should be part of the overall health system strengthening agenda. And this is through WHO global benchmarking process. We are also thinking of regulatory systems being important contributor to achieving universal health coverage and able to address public health priorities in the countries. We also support development of regulatory workforce in the countries through development of global competency framework and global regulatory curriculum, something that will be implemented together with the global benchmarking process. And ultimately, we promote regulatory cooperation, convergence, and harmonization, which is also very important for ANVISA, and ANVISA is becoming more and more involved and leading in the area of regulatory cooperation and harmonization. But we also promote work sharing and based on reliance on the work of other regulatory authorities which are trusted to inform our own national regulatory decision making. So quite often we hear about reliance and recognition, and we should be able to understand what do they mean and what is the difference. In terms of reliance, it is about reduction of our own work based on streamlining and taking into account the outputs of other regulatory authorities. In case of recognition, of course, it's slightly different because it is ultimately a replacement of our own work by something that has already been done by someone else. Of course, both concepts are very close and both reflect taking account of the output of other regulatory authorities. And both may be unilateral or mutual. And of course, the most important aspect in implementing these two concepts is that sovereignty of national regulatory decision is maintained in the hands of independent regulators in both cases. So none of these concepts would replace your own decision making or will deprive you from the right of making your own national decision. It is you who is ultimately responsible for any regulatory decision taken in your country, whether it is based on reliance or recognition. WHO has started to work with its partners, with the national regulatory authorities, to build up the WHO Good Reliance Practices concept many years ago. And this concept covers activities in the field of regulation of medical products. And we understand under medical products, medicines, vaccines, blood and blood products, and even including medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. And it is addressing all regulatory functions as they are defined in the WHO Global Benchmarking Tool, including registration or marketing authorization, safety and vigilance, market surveillance and control, licensing, regulatory inspections, laboratory activities, oversight of clinical trials, and NRA lot release, and many other regulatory functions, which are all involved throughout the whole product life cycle. And so the expectation was that this Good Reliance Practices document will be a high-level document that will be implemented in a second step after it is developed by a repository of various case studies, practice guides, and examples that would help countries to implement it in the real life. And after many years of work and discussions, finally, in October last year, in 2020, this document has been adopted by the expert committee on specification for pharmaceutical preparations in WHO, and is now available at this link, which is presented on this slide. The overall concept behind this document is that it is promoting a more efficient approach to regulation of medical products, and by this, it is the expectation that it will improve access to quality assured, effective, and safe medical products. In this document, there is a definition of reliance, which is considered as an act whereby the regulatory authority in one jurisdiction takes into account and gives significant weight to the assessments performed by another regulatory authority or trusted institution. And as I have mentioned, the relying authority in any case remains independent, responsible for its own decision, and accountable regarding this decision taken, even when it relies on the decisions done by someone else. So this document also describes the options to facilitate good regulatory decision-making based on reliance, and also based on the level of effort that regulatory authority could be able to put into the process of approving medical products. There are different options. Of course, the most common is the standard process when regulatory authorities are taking independent decisions based on their own reviews of the applications and their own inspections. This is the most time and resource consuming option of doing the work. But of course, then you are aware, then you are absolutely certain about the outcomes because it is done by yourself. The second option is based on leveraging regulatory work done by other competent and trusted authorities to reduce your own workload. It involves work sharing, including also some joint activities, assessments and inspections, and also some abridged or shortened pathways. Form is recognition, which could be unilateral or mutual when it is based on treaties or equivalent provisions, when you just recognize someone else's regulatory decision as your own. Of course, it's not sufficient to develop the guideline and put it on the shelf. We have to make sure that this guideline is implemented by our member states' national regulatory authorities. And so we have developed an implementation plan for these guidelines, which includes several steps. First of all, it needs to be translated in all 6 UN languages, which is ongoing. Unfortunately, Portuguese is not considered as WHO official language, but we also encourage translation of these guidelines into non-official WHO languages. This will be unofficial translation, but hopefully it will be done and it will also facilitate the work in Anvisa. We have also been able to issue the press release in April this year with all the details of this publication of this work. And we have been able to widely distribute this development through various regulatory networks. And we do also encourage participants of this workshop to share and advocate for these documents widely, as wide as possible, because we consider you as our advocates and as our ambassadors. So whenever there is an opportunity, please use this opportunity. We also expect that this document, this concept will be integrated within overall regulatory system strengthening activities of WHO, such as global benchmarking tool, which also includes development of institutional development plans for each of the countries. But as I have also mentioned, we are working on global competency framework, and this will be also very heavily linked with this framework. And most recently, you have heard perhaps about WHO activities to replace the currently existing concept of stringent regulatory authorities with a new concept of WHO listed authorities. And so this is also part of our work. We are also expecting that this good reliance practices concept will be entering smoothly into the existing umbrella of tools which are available already, such as good regulatory practices, quality management system for regulatory authorities, good review practices, good governance practices, and many others. And we also expect that good regulatory practices and good reliance practices will be part of as part of good practices guidance, and they will be also presented in WHO capacity building and training activities. But of course, it's also very important component to have it properly communicated and ensuring that our stakeholders and collaborators are buying in this concept. And so we are trying to present this concept through various external fora whenever there is an opportunity. And WHO is supportive to all initiatives which are promoting reliance and good regulatory practices. And so we will be also thankful to you if you also disseminate these messages widely. But we also would like to make it very practical, and we are now working on the development of detailed curriculum for implementation of this concept, but also we'll be developing dedicated modules on e-learning to make it easy for this concept to be implemented in the countries. and some additional guidance and next steps also will be ensured, and we will be developing an interactive repository of practical examples of how Reliance could be used in a specific situation in a specific country, and various documents such as questions and answers to provide additional information on the concept of Reliance. But Reliance is not just a theoretical concept. It is now already heavily implanted in regulatory work through facilitated regulatory pathways. All these examples are sharing the same main principles. They are based on sharing information and expertise, which includes assessment, inspection, reports, which will serve as a basis for your own national decision. And it will help you to avoid duplications. It is, of course, also based on voluntary participation of all parties, reference authorities, participating regulatory authorities, and the manufacturers or applicants. And we have already some very good examples of this work done or in the process of implementation, which includes a WHO collaborative registration procedure, which is existing now for many years and quite productive, and I will explain it in more details a bit later, but also in many different regional networks and regulatory harmonization initiatives which are supported by WHO, including some initiatives in your region, in PAHO region. And so we are also, we are also expecting that Reliance will be used to facilitate registration if there are some appropriate provisions, and that the regulators worldwide in any country can potentially benefit from already existing assessment and inspection reports developed by other trusted regulatory authorities to support their national regulatory decisions. But this can only happen if regulators in the countries have access to regulatory expertise from trusted parties, which includes complete assessment and inspection reports, and that they have the same product, the same essential technical data, and they understand how to apply this information with regards to the benefit risk for local population and local environment, and that they maintain intact national legislation and sovereignty, not affected, but also maintain confidentiality of commercially sensitive information, because it is important for the applicants. And ultimately, regulatory follow-ups are also properly managed, post-approval changes. So Reliance helps to translate the regulatory information from trusted sources to other countries to facilitate their national regulatory approvals. As I have mentioned already, inefficient regulatory systems themselves can be a strong barrier to access to medical products. And we do have already some good sources of quality information, such as WHO pre-qualification, for example, and approval by so-called stringent regulatory authorities. They provide very good basis for informed national regulatory decisions. But how do we get the pre-qualified and SRA-approved products to the patients faster and more efficiently? So this is the question for us. And how we ensure that continued supply of quality assured products takes place also post-registration. So we do believe that if the information, if the authoritative information is properly shared, and this information includes assessment, inspection reports, and testing results for WHO pre-qualified or SRA-approved products, then recipient national regulatory authorities can rely on this shared information to facilitate their own national decisions. And it will help them to avoid unnecessary duplications. It will help them to reduce their own regulatory burden. It will help them also to assess benefit risk in the local context. So if they apply this reliance or recognition concept, this will ensure timely access to most important products, quality assured products with positive benefit risk in their own countries. And then, which is also very important, it will help them to save some of their precious resources, sometimes very scarce resources, to reallocate them for conduct of other important activities which are always sacrificed in many countries. So when we are speaking about collaborative registration procedure, it is already very well known activity or effort led by WHO. We have now 44 participating national regulatory authorities, plus one regional economic community, which is CARICOM, which means that overall we have much more than 44 countries in this overall process. Unfortunately, Brazil is not so far part of this process, but we do hope that it will join at some point in time. So all the guidelines to implement collaborative registration procedure are existing on WHO website and easily accessible. And in case of interest for any country to join the procedure, we do have dedicated staff in our team to help countries to understand their potential benefits, the whole process, and all the chronology of the events to take in order to join the process and to benefit from existing flexibilities. So how does the collaborative procedure work? It is very simple, as I said. WHO's role is to be a neutral broker. We do not have any specific role except that we facilitate this process, which is in between of the applicant that is willing to register their product in the country A, let's say. So when they want to register their product, they approach the regulatory authority in the country. And then if the country is a member of a collaborative registration procedure, then they ask, do you really want to do everything from scratch yourself? Or maybe we can apply a collaborative registration procedure to this specific product. And then the process starts. The reports are shared by applicant through WHO, through secure platform that is called MEDNET. It is shared with the recipient country, and then the process starts, and they do the abbreviated assessment, and they agree to grant their national decision within a very limited time, which is 90 calendar days. And ultimately, then they reach their national decision. So as I say, target timeline is 90 days. So far, we have been able to register to countries participating in the procedure, have been able to register more than 600 products as of today. And you can see from this diagram that most of the time it was either less than 90 days or around 90 days. And this diagram shows also the registration of the products by therapeutic area, and you can see that mostly this diagram reflects the scope of WHO pre-qualification, and the lion's share of the products are in HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, but also for some other important therapeutic areas. And this is the registration by the countries. And you can see also we have some countries which are real champions, which have been able to register more than 60 products through collaborative registration procedure, while some other countries are still starting their involvement in this process. And this is also the registrations by the applicant or manufacturer, which is also very important. And we can see that there are also some sort of champions among the applicants, and you can imagine that it is also very beneficial for them because they have their products registered in the countries much faster. So it is also a smart decision by the manufacturers. Of course, this was collaborative registration procedure for pharmaceuticals. For vaccines, it's a little bit a different story. In fact, it has started even earlier for vaccines than for pharmaceuticals. But considering the specifics of vaccine as a medical product, which is very complex biologic product that requires absolutely different approach. It is not as active as for pharmaceuticals, but still the process is going on, and we have already quite a lot of development. We have the same 44 participating countries and one regional economic community, but of course with slightly different pace of the activities among these countries during the year. And we have also this, this is the slide that demonstrates the registrations of different vaccines through collaborative registration procedure. And also you can see that many different regions were involved in this process of registration of vaccines through collaborative registration procedure. And we have a special agreed way forward for vaccines to be also used in the context of collaborative registration procedure, which is a compromise between also the priorities for WHO, priorities for the recipient countries, but also willingness of the manufacturer. But most importantly, it is based on, it is considering the selection of vaccines to be entering into this process, which includes vaccines pre-qualified by WHO in the last 5 years. And this is intentionally because these new vaccines, relatively new vaccines, also ensure that there is a shareable report, shareable clinical CMC inspection and testing reports that could be given to the countries. So we have also been able to develop some recommendations based on our interactions with NRAs, with recipient NRAs, with other NRAs which are reference NRAs and provide dossiers and provide reports. So they are the source of information, and we still have inefficient awareness among manufacturers and applicants about all the benefits that collaborative registration procedure provides. So we do use all opportunities to advocate for wider implementation of a collaborative registration procedure. We do also have, received some commitments confirmed by the industry representatives about collaborative registration procedure for in vitro diagnostics and vector control products. So the work is progressing. There is a challenge of accessing unredacted reports. As I have mentioned, we need to have full reports for countries to really rely, to trust the information that they receive from stringent regulatory authorities. And so we need also to convince those NRAs to be ready to share their reports more openly. And of course, the performance on variations is not well monitored, because sometimes we have quite active involvement of reference NRAs into the process for the initial authorization, but not as active for post-approval variations and changes, and also timelines. So we are trying to correct these problems. Sorry. But the progress so far with collaborative registration procedure based on WHO pre-qualification is remarkable. For SRA-based CRP, there is still a need of improvement. And I'm now finishing my presentation with two last slides. And one is that, again, to remind to all of us that, unfortunately, timely access to medical products is a never-ending challenge for all countries. And all patients and consumers deserve access to quality-assured medical products with positive benefit-risk characteristics. This is the expectation and the demand of the whole concept of universal health coverage. And today's reality and demand is that if you wish, if you are intending to generate good quality national decisions, you are obliged to collaborate, and you must take into consideration the information which is available from other regulatory authorities, and not using the outputs and outcomes from other regulatory authorities, those who are better resourced, would mean lost opportunity, would mean duplication of efforts, would mean increased regulatory burden for you, and waste of very important resources that could be otherwise used elsewhere. And as a summary or conclusions, again, I would like to highlight that today, not a single regulator, even those who are very well equipped and very well resourced, they cannot anymore fulfill all regulatory work alone without collaborating with others. And the future of medical products regulation, as it is seen by us in WHO, is in convergence, harmonization, work sharing, collaboration, networking, which are all based on reliance and trust. To build this trust, of course, you need to speak to others, you need to collaborate, you need to do things jointly. You have to know the people, the parties that you would like to trust. If you don't know them, you will never trust. And what is also the reality is that regulators today are starting to operate as a functional network rather than individual player. But still, individual players can do a lot, focusing on the activities where they can demonstrate and give the best added value. And lastly, we believe that regulatory networks have a very important role in improving efficiency of the regulation of medical products. And ultimately, by doing this, they improve access to most needed essential medical products for all people. Thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation.
Obrigada, Dr. Samuel. Excelente apresentação. Vou só avisar o pessoal, aos participantes, que a gente vai abrir para as perguntas nos 20 minutos finais do workshop. Então, diante disso, a gente passa agora a palavra para a doutora Rebeca. E se vocês forem quiserem fazendo as perguntas no chat, já podem fazer, e a gente, ao final, também lê para o Dr. Samuel ou para a doutora Rebeca, tá bom? Doutora Rebeca, a palavra é sua.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for the opportunity to join you today. It's a real pleasure to be able to share industry's thinking on the topic of regulatory reliance. I'm here today in my capacity representing IFPMA. So IFPMA is the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. As you can see from this slide, it has membership of 50 associations in all 5 continents, and it truly aims to have a global perspective and a global understanding of some of the regulatory issues and activities that are occurring. And that's what I hope I will be sharing with you today, will be a picture of how regulatory reliance is being used globally and how industry is seeing these reliance mechanisms work in practice. So what's the current landscape? We've already heard from Dr. Azatian the definition of regulatory reliance, but I think it's important for us to just revisit that again. It's the act where a regulatory authority in one jurisdiction may take into account or give significant weight to, i.e. either totally or just partially rely on evaluations that are performed by another regulatory authority or a trusted institution in reaching its own decision. But ultimately, the relying authority remains responsible and accountable for the decisions taken. And I think that this idea of sovereignty really underpins how regulatory reliance is being used internationally. It's important that we recognise it as a valuable tool in the way that regulatory activities can be undertaken as part of a globalised regulatory network. And the next point that I want to make on this slide is that regulatory reliance is already a reality. You've seen this in Dr. Azatian's talk. He's given a number of very comprehensive examples of how regulatory reliance is being used around the world now. And it's important, and I want to reiterate his final point, that regulatory reliance is being practiced by national regulatory authorities of different resourcing and capacity levels. It's really independent of their maturity, whether or not they're a stringent regulatory authority or a potentially soon to be renamed WHO listed authority. The use of regulatory reliance is really a way of filling in or delivering your regulatory activities in the most efficient way, depending on your resources and capacity. The other point I wish to make is that regulatory reliance truly spans the product life cycle. So I've listed 3 examples here on the slide, and I'll be going into these in a little bit more detail in my later slides, but you can see that regulatory reliance is being used for inspections, for regulatory review, and also to manage post-approval changes. So this slide just brings us back to some of those fundamental concepts on what is regulatory reliance, what is recognition, and how do we perceive it and see it being used globally. And this is a really valuable figure. I've taken it out of the WHO Good Reliance Practices Guideline, and you saw a modified version of it in the previous talk. But the reason that I have included this today is that it's very important because it demonstrates the link between trust and the use of different reliance mechanisms. So what you can see coming along the bottom is that as trust builds between national regulatory authorities, the different forms of reliance can be practiced. And the WHO captures this as really improving or increasing efficacy. So the more you use reliance, the more efficiency savings you can make. But this also links to the need to build trust between different regulatory authorities. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Down here, we see standard processes. These are those independent decisions that a regulatory authority makes on its own, using all of its own resourcing and capacity. As trust builds, we see agencies able to leverage the regulatory work of others. Now, they may be doing this using work sharing, where each participant plays a role in undertaking a regulatory procedure. Or they may be using some form of a bridged process, utilizing reliance. And again, I'm going to cover this in a little bit more detail in a following slide. As trust continues to build, we've seen the growth of regional reliance mechanisms. And then finally, we move up to these top 2, which is unilateral recognition and mutual recognition, which are really the idea that you are recognizing the work of another authority, either in a unilateral fashion or in a mutual fashion. You're recognizing each other's work. But there's another way of looking at these different types of reliance that I'm going to cover next. And what we can see is how these forms of reliance can sit against an NRA's capability and the amount of effort that it takes to undertake registration. And when we look at this, we see that in a way, the stairway is almost turned upside down. The amount of level of effort required to practice recognition is very, very low. So it's the highest level of highest form of reliance because it actually allows you to use very little of your resource to undertake this. Then at an increasing level of effort, we see reliance. And here I'm talking about more unilateral reliance, i.e. that you're using somebody else's work to inform your own regulatory decision-making, but you are still having to do quite, and depending on the amount of work that you use, it may take more effort. When we move into work sharing, the amount of effort increases even more, because you're not just taking somebody else's work and using it to inform your own, you're actually participating. You're an active participant in this form of reliance. And this is the same for joint activities. And then finally, we can see here a full assessment, and Anvisa members will know more than I that the sheer volume of work that undertaking a national independent registration assessment, the amount of work that takes. Let's also look at how these sit within the concept of trust and treaty and the legal frameworks that are required. Underpinning all forms of reliance and recognition are the concepts of harmonization and convergence. Harmonization, when I use this term, I really am talking about harmonization of technical standards. And I know that this is very familiar to Anvisa colleagues because of your significant role in ICH, on the ICH Management Committee, and your continued activities to implement harmonized ICH technical guidances. And when we talk about harmonization, obviously what we hope is that these guidances are applied in an identical fashion among all of the different partners. This is slightly different to convergence. When we talk about regulatory guidelines converging or regulatory frameworks converging, we acknowledge that there may not be true harmonization, true technical harmonization. However, in practice, what convergence means is that regulatory activities are becoming more aligned, and they are increasingly delivering the same output, but maybe using slightly different processes. And those two concepts truly underpin the next stage, which is information sharing. Because only by sharing information among regulatory authorities can you understand where your processes are the same, where your processes are different, and whether or not, for example, you are using the same underpinning scientific guidelines to inform your regulatory activities. Both of these activities build trust. And we've heard from Dr. Azatian the importance of trust in driving reliance activities. As trust builds, we see an increase in work sharing between regulatory authorities and between the use of reliance, where you trust either a stringent regulatory authority or another trusted authority and the work that they are undertaking, and you use that trust to allow you to base a decision on their work. And then finally, we move to recognition. Recognition usually is underpinned by legal treaties. And an example of this is the Mutual Recognition Agreement between the European Union and a number of other countries globally. And it's important to remember that reliance and work sharing do not require legal treaties to be put into place, whereas recognition can sometimes need a requirement or a change in a legal framework to be practiced. So, what are the advantages of regulatory reliance? I'm not sure I need to go over this too much. We've heard previously, but I think it's important to remind the audience that regulatory reliance brings multiple advantages to all stakeholders involved in the approval of medicines. For patients and healthcare providers, it can allow timely access to safe, effective, and quality medicinal products. And that is the goal of national regulators, it's the goal of industry, and it's the goal of healthcare systems, and as we heard from the previous speaker, the goal of the WHO. For regulatory agencies, regulatory reliance can allow them to more efficiently use their resources by avoiding duplication of work that may have been undertaken in other parts of the world. And it also provides them with opportunities to strengthen their regulatory system while also maintaining sovereignty over decision making. And this is another way of making the same point that Dr. Azatian made. When you practice regulatory reliance, what you hope it will do will free up capacity within your existing system. And that freed up capacity can then be focused on another area of your regulatory system where you wish to strengthen or you wish to build capacity. Thinking about Brazil, you're in a really interesting position. Anvisa is a globally recognized regulator. You're a member of the ICH Management Committee, and you're also a regulator of regional reference within the Latin American region, recognized by PAHO. So you can participate in Reliance in a number of forms, both at that global level, potentially participating in work sharing programs such as Access, or through, as we've already seen, your involvement in Project Orbis with the United States. But equally, you yourselves act as a reference authority for other countries within the region. By freeing up capacity by practicing Reliance yourselves, this may allow you to focus some of your activities on strengthening your role as a reference authority within the region, potentially by publishing additional public assessment reports or additional inspection reports as appropriate to support Reliance activities by other countries. Also, you may be seeing you also may be able to repurpose some of your activity to focus on improving, for example, timelines for review of local products where regulatory reliance cannot be practiced. We often hear this a lot when we talk about global products. Now, in countries where there is strong local production, local companies will often say, well, how will regulatory reliance benefit us? In fact, regulatory reliance can benefit these products. By freeing up capacity within the existing regulatory system, it allows the reference or regulatory authority to focus that activity on these local products, where you will truly be the only regulator who may actually be undertaking that review. And it allows you to focus on these products and ensuring that that regulatory review is very robust, while relying on reviews that may be undertaken by reference authorities for multinational products. And finally, for manufacturers, it can provide benefits of streamlining management of regulatory submissions, global supply systems, and we hope improve predictable and timely approvals. But how best to implement it, and what are the best practices? Well, firstly, when can we use regulatory reliance? Again, you've seen this covered by Dr. Azatian, but it's really important to remember that the WHO Good Reliance Practices Guideline clearly states that regulatory reliance can be used to address all of the regulatory functions in the full life cycle of a medicinal product. So we shouldn't just be thinking about regulatory reliance as a tool to speed registration of products, though of course that is a very important use for this tool. So I hope to share with you in the next few slides a quick overview of some of the global reliance mechanisms that we have seen occurring, and then some of our learnings and recommendations based on industry's experiences of using some of these mechanisms. So I'm not going to try, in the time that we have, to give you a deep, detailed oversight of every single one of these projects, I'm afraid. But what I will hope to do is just draw your attention to the archetypes or the styles of reliance that these different frameworks use, and also the scope of the regulatory functions that they cover. So firstly, let's start with work and information sharing. And what we see is this can often, this is a way of partnering between regulatory authorities. We saw it about midway up the step, and these regional initiatives can be really beneficial in strengthening relationships between authorities. A good example of this is the Access Consortium, which is an agreement between Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Interestingly, the Access Consortium doesn't focus only on innovative products. It has a dedicated generic products work stream as well. And they also aim to support and work share and a number of other areas such as pharmacovigilance guidances and potentially inspections. We see information sharing in the use of Project Orbis, and this is obviously led by the United States with participation from other authorities, including Brazil. And it allows and provides a framework for concurrent submission and review of oncology products to ultimately allow regulators to share their thinking during that review process on these novel products, to understand directly from the United States FDA what their thinking is on the product, but ultimately each independent regulator will undertake a full separate review. And this is where Access and Project Orbis differ. In the Access Consortia, they actually share out the review of the dossier, and that's in direct contrast to Project Orbis, where each authority undertakes a full review on their own, but they come together to discuss their findings and potential areas of concern. Moving across the slide, we see a number of joint assessment and regional reliance mechanisms now globally. We have the East African Community, we have the Zazabona Initiative, we have ECOWAS, and obviously those three are based in the African region. But this is not limited solely to Africa. We see a joint assessment coordinating group among the Southeast Asian nations, ASEAN. We have the Caribbean regulatory system, which Dr. Azatian mentioned. And we also see these regional initiatives among the Gulf Health Council. And finally, we see the use of recognition. So recognition, while rarer than reliance, because it usually requires, like I said, some form of formal treaty, is not currently unknown globally. A good example of this is the European Union's centralized authorization procedure. We take the European Union's way of approving medicines very much for granted, but in fact, this is one of the earliest forms of reliance. And I think it's very important to remember that this is underpinned, obviously, by the Treaty of the European Union. We see recognition also in the use of the OECD mutual acceptance of data in the assessment of chemicals. We see recognition in the use of the EU mutual recognition agreements of GMP inspections. And we also see the same, so a mutual recognition agreement on the recognition of GMP inspections within the ASEAN nations. So let's see some more of these different forms of reliance and where they sit across different regulatory functions. So here we have registration and marketing authorization. So all of these different pathways relate to the initial registration or marketing authorization of a novel product. Now, some of these Dr. Azatian mentioned, not unsurprisingly, as these are the global mechanisms. And we see here the WHO's pre-qualification program. We see their collaborative registrative procedure program. We see the US FDA's Project Orbis program as a global program aimed at driving registrations. And again, here again is the Access Consortium, a work sharing consortium, but that truly gives global approvals due to the participation of the countries involved. Next, let's look at regional mechanisms, where we see reliance being approved, reliance being used regionally to support product approvals. And again, we see here is the Caribbean regulatory system. We have the EU centralized authorization procedure. We have the Gulf Health Council in the Middle East. We have the MHRA's new reliance procedure building on the European Commission decision, and that's obviously in the UK. And then we also see the reliance on certificates of suitability to the monographs of the European Pharmacopoeia. Now let's come to what may be of more interest to ANVISA, depending on the forms of reliance that you wish to use. And these are the unilateral or multilateral forms of reliance. So it's important to remember that when we talk about global and regional forms of reliance, we're really talking about agencies who wish to work together to undertake some form of reliance in a regional fashion or across their different regulatory authorities. But for those countries that wish to practice reliance as an independent state and not necessarily participate in work sharing, these are the forms of reliance that we also see occurring globally. And what we see is forms of reliance such as the EU M4 All program in the European Union, which is when the EMA will grant a scientific decision or a scientific assessment of a product for a product that isn't necessarily going to get approved in Europe. And then a scientific assessment can be used to support global approval through a tool such as the collaborative register procedure. So a country may choose to accept the EMA's scientific assessment of that product in place of doing their own assessment. We have the UK's decentralised and mutual recognition reliance procedures for marketing authorisations. So this is following the UK's exit from the European Union and obviously the loss of their participation within the European regulatory framework. What we see now is that the MHRA is relying on and has a process where it will rely on approvals granted by the European Commission in a unilateral fashion. There is a programme run by Swissmedic where, similar to the programme managed by the EU, the Swissmedic will undertake a regulatory review of a product. But what makes this slightly different to the European Union's programme is that Swissmedic will also invite those participating regulatory authorities to participate in the review themselves, and they can then choose to rely on Swissmedic's scientific opinion to approve the product. I'm not going to go into all of these because of time, but I think it's also important to draw your attention to the fact that we see a significant amount of reliance on testing based on reference stringent authority approvals in other countries. And we also see reliance procedures for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. So moving into a different regulatory function, here are a couple of examples where we see reliance being used to support clinical trials oversight. I think most of us are sadly familiar or happily familiar, depending on I've not phrased that very well. The current situation with COVID, I think, has made us all very sadly familiar with the Solidarity clinical trial that the WHO is coordinating globally. But this is a good example of reliance in practice in delivery of this trial. We also see regional reliance being used to support clinical trial oversight, for example, within the EU with their voluntary harmonisation procedure, with the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, AVAREF, and also with some activity in East Africa. Interestingly, we see very little forms of unilateral or multilateral reliance currently used in clinical trials oversight, but that isn't to say that it would not be possible. Now we come to regulatory inspections. In many ways, this is one of the most well understood forms of reliance, and many countries have been using organisations such as PICS to support the reduction in their national inspection activities. So globally, we obviously have the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, PICS, and what we see there is that depending on a country's involvement, they may choose to fully rely on inspections performed by a PICS member in another country, and so perhaps only undertake their own national inspections rather than undertaking international inspections. We also see regional inspection reliance, for example, through the use of the ASEAN Mutual Recognition Agreement. And we also see this with the EU's Mutual Recognition Agreement on GMP inspections. We see a number of different forms of reliance also being used across different forms of regulatory areas. So we see reliance both in the vigilance space, for laboratory testing and NRA lot release, and also for marketing surveillance and control. So these are all aligned with the different areas that the WHO benchmarking tool looks at. And you can see that we've tried to capture some examples of global, regional, and unilateral or multilateral forms of reliance that are being used. In the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these, but I think it's very important to draw your attention to the fact that, for example, in Singapore, they practice reliance to support post-approval changes of products. And that's something that from an industry perspective, we're fully supportive of. If not only for new products or products that are already registered in the market, but also for products that get approved using a reliance mechanism. In an ideal world, if a product is approved using a reliance mechanism, all of the post-approval changes that go with that approval should also be able to be managed in through a reliance procedure. So why do we see so many different forms of reliance? I think it's really important at this point to take a step back and remember that one size does not fit all. So why do so many different countries and so many different regional initiatives use these different forms of reliance? Well, ultimately, that's because each country has to have a unique, specific reliance strategy. And what informs that strategy is a number of different considerations. Firstly, is their relationship with other national regulatory authorities, perhaps through treaties or through memorandums of understanding or through participation in international consortia. How well do they know another regulatory authority, and what level of trust do they have with those authorities? There's also, it's critical that national regulatory authorities take account of their existing capabilities and capacity. If you are able to deliver something very fast and very efficiently, why would you necessarily choose to practice reliance in that area? Instead, you may look at an area where you struggle to meet deadlines, or you see opportunities for efficiency saving. Another way to think about this could also be other technologies where you may feel that reliance could be practiced. And I think then about some of these innovative medicinal products that we see coming through globally. For gene therapies, will every regulatory authority in the world need to undertake a true independent, unique review of a gene therapy, a highly complex product? Or could perhaps some agencies practice reliance on these approvals from other authorities? Trust. This is central to reliance, and I think both myself and Dr. Azatian have reinforced the importance of the trust that needs to exist, not only between the reliance and the reference regulatory authorities, but also the trust with other stakeholders in the system. It's important that anyone participating in a reliance procedure has an element of trust, because without that, there will always be the need to want to see everything and check everything. And those time savings and those opportunities for efficiencies will be lost. It's important that you're looking really to drive efficiency through the use of reliance. Regulatory authorities often also look at areas of unmet need and emergency preparedness. And I think we've all seen the volume of reliance that has been used, for example, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, most importantly, reliance will be decided on based on the regulatory system's needs. So not only about making efficiency savings, but also where there are real opportunities to strengthen that system. So what are some of the practical considerations when thinking about implementing reliance procedures? When we look back at a number of these reliance procedures globally, there are some key recommendations that we would make to an agency considering implementing reliance. So the first thing would be provide guidance on the documentation that you require. So what documents will you require? sponsors to provide? What documents may you require reference authorities to provide? How will you plan to use these documents? Will you be reviewing them? Will you just be storing them so you have them if anyone asks you? You know, think about what documents you're asking for and what purpose you plan to put them to. And then back to my point about who should be providing which documents, it's very critical that that both sponsors and regulatory authorities have transparency on who is providing what, in addition to any formal dossier that you may be submitting. A Reliance procedure should have a clear procedural guidance. So ideally, it will give predictable and transparent timelines to the sponsor. And this will encourage industry to potentially try a new form of regulatory approval, for example, or a new form of inspection, or a new form of clinical trials oversight, depending on where you plan to practice reliance. But in all of those cases, ideally, the regulatory authority in question will be coming out and very clearly saying, you know, this is how we're planning to use it, and this is the time that we think it will take. And we would hope that when using Reliance, this should allow for a shortening of existing regulatory procedures. And this comes back to, I think it was Dr. Azatian's first or second slide, when he talked about the shortening of time when undertaking regulatory activities. I think by practicing Reliance, you hope that any timelines will be shorter than a standard independent, for example, regulatory review. Procedures ideally will be simple, straightforward, and pragmatic. And I think very critically, we would ask that regulators make publicly available the list of acceptable reference national regulatory authorities. So who do you trust to have done some of these activities? And that list may be different depending on the regulatory function in question. And here's a really good example of this. If I said, should PICS be a reference trusted authority for all areas of regulatory activity, I would hope that the audience would very quickly come back to me and say no. Because while PICS is very important and it plays a very critical central role, it really only covers regulatory inspections. So if you said to me, do you view PICS as a trusted authority for regulatory inspections? I would say yes. And I would absolutely support them being listed as a trusted authority. But if you said to me, should PICS be viewed as a reference authority for marketing review and authorizations, I would say no, because PICS exists to support regulatory inspections. So you may find that when you're implementing different forms of reliance, that list of reference national regulatory authorities or that list of trusted regulatory authorities may be different depending on the form of reliance that you're planning to use. And like I said, we would hope that when reliance is implemented practically, it will lead to faster approvals overall, a reduced workload, not only for industry, but also for national regulatory authorities. And we would hope that there is the possibility of using reliance throughout the entire product lifecycle. So my next couple of slides are really two of those areas where we have seen some significant challenges to how reliance can actually be used practically in some of those mechanisms that I shared in previous slides. Effective mechanisms for information sharing between national regulatory authorities is truly an essential element of reliance. Dr. Azatian made this point that it is very important that regulatory authorities are able to access the documentation that they need to undertake a reliance procedure. And that it's also important that that documentation can be provided in a way that protects commercial sensitivities. However, there are some practical challenges with both the terminology and the practicality of sharing some of these materials. So we often see regulatory reliance frameworks using the phrase sharing of unredacted assessment reports. The challenge we have with that is that there is no global template of assessment report. There is no ICH guideline that dictates how an assessment report should be written. So an assessment report from the US FDA looks very different to an assessment report written by the EMA, which looks very different to an assessment report written by, for example, Japan's PMDA. The amount of redaction across these different reports also varies quite significantly depending on the legal and technical frameworks in place within those different reference authorities. So this can make it quite challenging for sponsors, for example, to share unredacted assessment reports with every country in the world. There can also be challenges with the volume of information that are requested. Because the terminology unredacted assessment report is it is interpreted differently by different reference authorities and different reliant authorities, we see some regulatory authorities who regard an assessment report as the final report at the end of a regulatory review procedure, for example. But we see some other regulatory authorities who may request not only the final reference report, but all of the interim assessment information, including question and answer documents and any other regulatory information authored by the reference authority during that review procedure. This can be equally challenging for sponsors to provide. And I think it again brings back to that question of what information is requested and how does the reliant authority plan to use it. So why are you asking for it and how will you use it? It's important to think about as well how these documents will be shared. If it has been possible to provide a very comprehensive amount of assessment report or assessment information, including interim assessment data, it's very important to remember that this does need to be protected because of potential commercial sensitivities and patient data, and also the reference regulators' information that they may not wish to have shared into the public domain. It's for these reasons that we feel that the use of public assessment reports where possible should be encouraged within Reliance procedures. These documents are already publicly available and they provide those key insights into the rationale of a regulatory decision-making process. The next area where we have also seen some questions and some challenges is on this concept of sameness of product. It's very important to remember that for multinational companies, we will be providing the same product internationally. However, there are sometimes people who will challenge us on this or will say that we're sending potentially different documentation and that means that the product is not the same. So why do we see these challenges and what does this mean in practice when you want to practice reliance? Industry fully agrees that the physical medical product is expected to be the same between the reference authority and the reliant authority. Okay, so let me be very clear about that. The medicine that we get approved in Europe should be the same medicine physically as the medicine that could be supplied in Brazil. But we have to recognize that in practice, the dossier submitted may ultimately differ. And this is due to different national regulatory requirements or other possible justifiable differences. So what does that look like in practice? We may see differences in documentation. So where, for example, and I'm going to keep using the example of Europe, we may see the European Medicines Agency asking for information in one format that may not usually be required for example, an approval in Brazil. In that case, when Anvisa comes to look at the European assessment report or some of the dossier that goes with it, you may say, well, wait a minute, you're sending us a slightly different dossier. Why is that? Why? And it's because we have to meet the national regulatory requirements. So if you're asking us for different information in your dossier that's not aligned with what Europe asks for, the two dossiers will be slightly different. And that's the same with whether you use the US as a reference authority, whether you use Japan as a reference authority, whether you use Australia as a reference authority. Very sadly, there is no single global harmonized regulatory dossier. And so there will be differences in the documentation that are submitted to different jurisdictions. There may be differences also in the indications, and this is often due to public health needs. So it should not be surprising that a product may be seeking a reliance approval with a slightly different set of indications than that granted by the reference authority. And an example of that may be where a product in the reference authority is being used in the first line, but it may be being used in the second or third line in the reliance authority, or vice versa. Equally, you may see some indications not being suitable for the health system or for the population need. And in those circumstances, you may not be seeking the full breadth of indications. And so the reliance authority may not get given all of the clinical data that relates to those indications that the sponsor isn't seeking. There may be commercial sensitivities why you may not be seeking to file all of the same indications in every market. There may be competitor products in some markets that aren't in others, for example. And there are also maybe life cycle management considerations. The current framework for post-approval changes is very divergent globally. And so sponsors may choose to provide different levels of information within the dossiers to manage those different post-approval change frameworks. We hope that the implementation of ICH Q12 will help to solve this, but at the current time, this is a real and practical reason why documentation may differ between different authorities. There may also be some differences in the physical product. The formulation or product appearance may be slightly different, potentially dependent on an excipient that is approved in one region but not in another. Pack sizes may be different depending on the indications that you're seeking. And I've already mentioned that different indications may be being sought. All of these may mean that the sameness of product could be potentially questioned. So how do we manage this disconnect? The WHO Good Reliance Practices Guidance makes it very clear that it wishes to see verification of the same physical product as part of an underpinning reliance mechanism. And this is where I draw your attention to justification of differences. The WHO's Good Reliance Practices Guideline clearly acknowledges that there may be some justifiable differences, and that the potential for these needs to be assessed by the manufacturer or the sponsor, and that the relying national regulatory authority also needs to be made aware of these differences and have a conversation, have a dialogue, and confirm whether or not they're prepared to accept that these differences have occurred and why they have occurred. So this is the point that I want you to take away. It's not that you shouldn't be seeking to have sameness or confirmed sameness of product, but it's also important that you allow for justification of differences and that the sponsors and the regulators are able to have some dialogue and explain why these differences may have occurred. So having covered a number of the practical challenges, let's go back to the opportunities that Reliance offers us. If we see further implementation of Reliance, we hope that it will not only drive convergence globally, but that ultimately it may also drive additional harmonization activities. And for countries that are already implementing globally harmonized guidelines, such as Anvisa and your participation in ICH, we hope that this will provide a foundation and a real opportunity for you to participate in Reliance procedures. We see Reliance supporting capacity building. As I said, by using Reliance and freeing up capacity, it allows you to focus and strengthen on areas where you may wish to build capacity and capability. And we also see Reliance building trust, not only between national regulatory authorities, but amongst all stakeholders who will be participating in these procedures. So my final remarks. We have a commitment towards convergence. We want to confirm that we wish to supply the same quality standards, the same quality products globally. We want patients to have access to these products. And that is why, we are keen to see Reliance practiced. And it's also why we're keen to see some of these practical challenges around the topic of sameness addressed. We ask regulators who are thinking about implementing Reliance for consistency. Please give us clear guidance on documentation that you require, on the timelines that you will be using. And we hope that Reliance will lead to a reduction in regulatory burden, not only for the agency themselves, but also for the industry. And our key enabler is confidence amongst the different participating groups. We want to see appropriate mechanisms for sharing information between regulators themselves and also between regulators and sponsors so that data can be shared in a commercially confidential way. And we also hope that this will build trust between stakeholders participating in Reliance procedures. At the end of this slide, in conclusion, I would say that from an IFPMA perspective, we are fully supportive of strengthening regulatory systems and increasing efficiency through the use of regulatory reliance. And we are confident that the effective implementation of regulatory reliance will benefit patients, healthcare providers, regulatory authorities, and industry. And I've provided some links to a number of position papers that go into some of those areas that I've touched on in a lot more detail than I've managed to today. Thank you so much.
Obrigada, doutora Rebeca. Uma apresentação muito bem elaborada.
Nós vamos as perguntas agora?
Isso, Só. A gente vai abrir os microfones dos participantes, eles fiquem à vontade em fazer as perguntas, pode fazer em português, nós temos a tradução. Eu sei que foram feitas algumas, a Priscila também está coordenando aqui, foram feitas algumas perguntas no chat. O doutor Samuel já respondeu, acho que duas, mas a gente vai pedir para o pessoal fazer a pergunta, falar a pergunta, para assim que todo mundo possa também ouvir e compartilhar com vocês. Então, tem o Matheus, a Érica, o Clóvis, a Daniela, que escreveram no chat. Se vocês puderem fazer as perguntas verbalmente, fica mais...
Juliana também tem.
Juliana também. Juliana?
Eu posso falar? Então?
Desculpa, estava em mudo.
Pode.
Desculpa, Matheus.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Sim.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sim,
yes.
Escutamos você.
Okay, so I already sent my question and Dr. Samuel already answered that. However, I would like to extend to Dr. Rebecca. Thanks for the presentations. I know that Dr. Rebecca already mentioned during her presentation. However, do you know if it's a common understanding or it's a common practice to share the documentation, the dossier analysis between one health authority with other? I know that must be a mutual agreement for safety or for confidentiality aspects. However, I would like to Dr. Rebecca to comment a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really great question. And I think it depends on the form of reliance. I know it has been a genuine practical challenge when some countries practice unilateral reliance. So they are choosing a list of reference authorities and they are saying, we will trust countries A, B, and C. And they may not have had dialogue with those reference authorities in question to say, are you happy for assessment information to be shared? In those circumstances, and depending on the country in question, there can be practical challenges to sharing so-called unredacted assessment reports or complete assessment information. While a number of reference authorities have agreements with some global regulators, there are a number of global regulators that they do not have agreements with. And a good example of this is the FDA. The FDA, in fact, does not produce an unredacted assessment report. They provide the public report both to the company in question, but also into the public domain. And that report comes redacted. The company in question doesn't have an unredacted version of that report, so we cannot provide it. We can only provide the redacted public form. So this is where this language around unredacted reports can lead to real practical challenges for regulatory review. When countries practice work sharing, they absolutely will be sharing the full regulatory assessment. So when I think about the Access Consortia as an example of this, the regulators who participate in that review are all sharing their review on the different sections of the dossier with each other. But they are doing this under that memorandum of understanding and under those commercial confidentiality agreements that allows them to share this information. So that's two examples. I'm also very aware of, and Dr. Azatian would probably be a better person than me to cover the recent work and approval of some of the COVID vaccines. And in that circumstance, the WHO ensured that there were commercially confidentiality agreements between all of the participating regulatory authorities, which allowed them to share the full dossier review with all of those participating agencies to ultimately rapidly see the granting of the emergency use licenses in so many countries within a remarkably short amount of time. But I think that this is where that dialogue between reference authorities needs to occur. And if an agency is also wishing to be a reference authority themselves, what information about their own regulatory procedures are they willing to share with others? Because if you wish to be a reference authority, what part of your regulatory assessment would you be prepared to share to others who will rely upon you? So it's I think still an area of discussion internationally.
Thanks so much.
Bom dia, eu não sei qual é a ordem das perguntas.
Você mesmo, Matheus, fica à vontade.
Posso seguir?
Pode
tá bom.
seguir.
A minha pergunta, acho que foi endereçada pela Rebeca nos slides finais, com relação ao sameness of products, e aí a minha questão ainda permanece no sentido de saber como que as indústrias, né, as diferentes filiais, né, das indústrias, elas estão organizadas, né, no mundo para submeter, né, dossiês que são de produtos que são únicos, vamos dizer, né, para as diferentes autoridades reguladoras e, inclusive, com relação às mudanças pós-registro, né, como que essas mudanças também são submetidas como se diz, paralelamente entre as autoridades regulatórias estrangeiras.
That's another great question. And I'm afraid there is no simple answer because each company will have a slightly different way of managing this. It's important also to think that depending on the different regulatory frameworks in place among different countries, we can't actually file in the same way in every market. Some companies have national affiliates, so they may have local companies within each country, and that company will be the one that will be seeking the marketing authorization, but they may be wishing to rely on a product that was approved, for example, in Europe. In those circumstances, those are the kinds of justifiable differences that you hope that the regulatory authority could have the conversation with the company. So I'm going to use my company as an example, Pfizer. If we filed in Pfizer Brazil, we would hope that we could send an information to Anvisa and say, this was the product, it was approved by the FDA, the US license is to Pfizer International, headquartered in New York, but we are the same company, it is the same product, and you will be receiving the same product from the same factory, perhaps, as our US approved product. But to this point of factories, it also depends on how products are supplied. The reason I want to make this point is because it's very rare now for a global product to have a single factory associated with its manufacture. You may have 2 or 3 or 4 all approved under the same license. In those circumstances, you would not want to potentially exclude the supply of a product from a factory in Europe because it was approved by the US. You would want to be able to say, well, if it's the European, the product that's being supplied in Europe is the same as the product that's being manufactured in the US, but we will be supplying this country from our European supply factory, not our US factory, but it is the same product and it's being manufactured using the same process. In those circumstances, those again, maybe some of those justifiable differences where you would want to be able to have that conversation with the regulator and explain it.
Dr. Samuel, algum complemento?
Thank you. Just to say that what Rebecca has also mentioned, I think COVID-19 pandemic was an interesting, maybe very tragic situation, but also very remarkable in terms of understanding how flexible regulators could be when there is a need. Because regulatory work is considered as a bureaucratic work in a good sense of this expression. And we know that it's not easy to get authorization from regulatory authorities in many situations. But COVID-19 was an exceptional situation where the risk was the benefit was much higher than the risk. For example, for COVID-19 vaccines, when they were developed and they were made available, but then they had to be also introduced in the countries, because countries have all special provisions. Most countries now have some emergency authorization mechanisms in place. But as Rebecca has mentioned, Pfizer or any other company, they would not be able to submit dossiers to all 195 WHO member states for a COVID-19 vaccine and expect that it will be treated in a shortest possible time. The delays will be enormous anyway. it is just physically not possible. But the people were dying and the vaccine was needed. So there must be some mechanism in place that would allow also this life-saving products to reach patients as soon as possible. And by a kind of, for me, it was a miracle that we have seen how countries were able to address this problem just within several days. Many countries, within several days, they were able to grant some sort of an authorization to this product in order to enable the delivery of the product in the country and starting the vaccination. So in a way, Reliance is a great mechanism and very flexible mechanism. And it is true that the way how you apply it also depends on the situation. It depends on the benefit and risk. So you have to weight it. And ultimately, the decision is in the hands of the regulators, the final decision. No one can force them to come up with one or another decision because they are remaining responsible for any decision they take. So they have to weight the risk and see if the benefit prevails the risk, and then they grant their own decision in a specific situation. So this is very much what I wanted to say, just to add to Rebecca's perfect contribution.
Yeah. Obrigada, Dr. Sambel. Dr. Cláudio Osvaldo tem uma pergunta?
Então, na verdade, é bem simples. Eu gostaria só de saber se os palestrantes têm alguma experiência, algum conhecimento sobre alguma agência reguladora que já utiliza o mecanismo de Reliance, o reconhecimento, para os casos de avaliação e aprovação de pesquisas clínicas.
Yeah, maybe I can just share my experience of working with African regulators, because in my presentation I mentioned that Reliance applies to all types of regulatory functions. In fact, it is true. And authorization of clinical trials is one of the activities that is in the hand of the national regulators. And in Africa, we have a great example of AVAREF, which is African Vaccines Regulatory Forum. It has been established initially as a platform for African regulators to collaborate in the process of authorization of clinical trials. And now, initially for vaccines, now they are dealing with all types of medical products. So the scope is wider. And so when there is a product that is of continental importance, then it comes to AVAREF. And then they do, sometimes they do joint assessment, sometimes they do different types of activities, but the outcomes of their work are becoming available for all African regulatory authorities in 55 countries. And so they act as a technical committee or as a continental technical working group for the whole continent for authorization of clinical trials. And their work is really remarkable in accelerating this step of regulatory work, which is to authorize clinical trials. But maybe Rebecca has some more examples.
I think, you know, the one that immediately springs to mind beyond the AVAREF example is actually Europe, where obviously within the European framework, Europe is interesting at the moment because they will shortly be implementing the new clinical trials regulation. But in that framework, it's more of a work sharing format that the participating countries for a piece of clinical research will have to review and approve a clinical trial within a period of time. And then once that trial is granted, it is granted across all of those countries that have reviewed it together. So it's more work sharing probably than unilateral reliance. I think the reason that we see maybe more of these regional clinical trial mechanisms rather than potentially more unilateral forms of reliance on clinical research is because of the ethical aspect of clinical research, and that, again, local countries' legal frameworks and ethical frameworks often require a national review. But you could still see reliance, and I'm speaking somewhat theoretically here, you could still see reliance being used. For example, you may say, you know, I will choose to rely on the review of the protocol from a scientific perspective if it has been approved in one of these other countries. But from an ethical perspective, you may still wish to undertake that ethical review at a national level and ensure that that protocol is meeting your national ethical requirements. And that's a potential, a really good way of demonstrating how reliance can be used to support your system rather than override it completely.
Obrigada. A próxima pergunta é da Érica. Érica, deseja fazer sua pergunta pelo microfone?
Oi, Pri, consegue me ouvir?
Conseguimos, sim.
Então, tá bom. A minha pergunta vai para a Rebeca. Eu sou a Érica Machado, a Head de Assuntos Regulatórios da MSD. Eu queria saber se existe métricas, né, que realmente demonstre a efetividade da implementação de mecanismos de boas práticas, né? Porque hoje a gente vê que a Anvisa ela tem uma diretiva estratégica muito bem definida quanto a essas iniciativas, mas a implementação tem sido um pouco difícil, justamente porque os revisores não têm visto muito valor agregado em relação à otimização de tempo, né, em relação a esses mecanismos. Então, eu não sei se existe para os países que já implementaram métricas, né, que possam nos ajudar a entender melhor essa melhoria.
I can tell you a little bit. So the savings that Reliance can offer will obviously depend on where it is being used within the regulatory framework. The recent COVID example that we mentioned, obviously the timing, dramatically shortened. But when we're talking about using Reliance outside of an emergency setting, the country that probably has the strongest metrics that I have seen is Singapore. So Singapore has a number of reliance mechanisms in place, and they have clearly demonstrated that for them, the use of reliance has shortened the review time of products, but also made efficiency savings within their agency. And I have seen them, though I don't know if I have the deck of slides, I'm afraid, but I have seen Singapore present sharing these metrics, not only for regulatory review, but also for post-approval changes, where they were able to demonstrate that by using post-approval changes, you're using reliance to support post-approval changes, that they had actually managed to increase the efficiency of reviews per member of staff very significantly. So these metrics do exist for countries where reliance procedures have been implemented for a longer period of time. And I think it would be important for Anvisa, if looking to implement different forms of reliance, that they, if possible, capture some metrics as they go through, because I fully agree that the use of key performance indicators will really demonstrate the value this can bring. I think to your other point on reliance may not have led to time savings, in part, this may be because how is reliance being used, where was it being used in the system, and the trust that people have felt in placing some of the work on another authority. For those countries that implement reliance on other people's inspections, that, you know, the metrics are dramatic, because they go from doing, you know, however many hundreds of inspections outside of their country to no inspections outside of their country, and the savings are very obvious, but they are sometimes harder to capture within a system such as regulatory review. I do know that APEC has been looking at putting in some KPIs, key performance indicators, for Reliance, and that's some of their current activity. And I think that they are looking to capture some metrics around how Reliance has strengthened different regulatory systems within the APEC region.
Ok. Mais alguma pergunta que alguém queira fazer?
Thank you very much. Obrigada.
Thank you for inviting us. It was a pleasure. Goodbye.
Goodbye. And thank you to the translators as well.